Hello, friends. Doug Schaible here, your free-range podcaster, welcoming you to the Premature Bible Institute. Thanks so much for coming today. I just appreciate you all being here. I trust that these lessons will give you an idea about how much God really cares, not just for the people of Israel or people of their time, but all people. He really does care. He doesn't want to see them destroyed. He wants them to come to Him and admit that they have sinned, because that's the truth. They have. And that He really wants to be an encouragement and a blessing and have them enjoy Him forever, and all that entails. So trust the Lord will give us good insight into His character, His nature, so that we can respond correctly and see our world from a true perspective. That being said, we're going to start into our lesson, but I want to do a little review from the last one. The last one, we talked about how God led Israel out. They're being redeemed, or let me put it this way, delivered. Let's put it that way. They're being delivered from Egypt. And as they're leaving out, it says that God led them by a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud during the day. And so wherever that pillar went, that's where they went. And by pillar, I mean, just a big column of smoke or fire. And they followed that, and that's where God was leading them. And but in the process of doing that, after they'd left, Pharaoh decided to change his mind one more time. And he said, it's not good that these people are getting away. Who's going to build our cities? Who's going to do all our work? All these things. And so he decides to go after them and recapture them. And so he takes off after them. And what God did is in order to protect the Israelites, what he did is he put them in a place where they had no way of escape. There was absolutely no way they could escape the Egyptians that were coming after them. So that pillar of fire and pillar of smoke, the column there, he took it and moved it from the front of the people and put it back behind the people, in between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and so that they couldn't get into them. And as a result of that, when people looked back and saw all the Egyptians coming, what they did is they started complaining. And then they started complaining, boy, why'd you do this? We could have been safe back in Egypt, but now we're going to be destroyed. So that's when God moved the pillar of fire and smoke back there behind the people. So, and the reason for him doing this was he wanted the people to see that God is God. And he can do what he sees fit. And also, the people of Israel, they were just complaining more about Pharaoh than they were about God. They feared. Let me put it this way: they complained, and then they feared Pharaoh more than they feared God, who they just saw wipe out Egypt. So anyway, that's how it goes with the way people are. They think irrationally when they sin. So God showed them who's God, and what God did is He put them right there in a place where they couldn't escape. And God tells Moses, He says, "Here's what you need to do." He says, "You need to lift up your staff, put it out over the water, and split the water, and then walk through to the other side on dry land." Well, I know there's been, like I said, some theologians who believe it was just 6 inches of water or whatever that they were walking over. And then I think, well, what's the point of the story then? If they could escape on 6 inches of water, the big miracle been then he drowned an entire army in 6 inches of water. But that isn't what happened. God parted the waters. They walked over on dry ground. And then the Egyptians followed after him to take him, even after there were columns of water on both sides. And then God, once the Israelites got to the other side, then God caused all the waters to come back and it drowned all the Egyptian army. So it was a bad mess for all of them. So anyway, but now we're going to move on to the story. So now they're out there. They're starting to head out into the place where God wants them to go. So Israel lets Moses and Aaron know what they think about their journey from Egypt. In other words, they're out their ways and they're going on. And so here's what happened. Exodus 16, verses 1 through 3. And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they departed from the land of Egypt. So this is about 6 weeks afterwards. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." So here they are complaining once again. It's only 6 weeks after this whole thing happened. And so they're out there complaining, says, man, you brought us out here to starve, I just keep thinking, didn't they just see what God had done? And, but they hadn't. It didn't take long for them just to turn their backs and go their own, the old way that they always did. So it was just 6 weeks afterwards, and they were wandering in the wilderness. They probably couldn't raise a garden anywhere because they had to keep moving all the time. So there wasn't any garden, and they had to have food. And they had they couldn't hunt for much food. I mean, you had about 2.5 million people there, and all they could do is trust the Lord. And had they just decided to do that, God would have done so much for them. But guess what? He still does something for them, even though they're complaining. Only God could help them, and that was the point that God brought them into this, is so that they would learn to trust their Creator, not their circumstances that they were in, and look to their own means to provide for themselves. God wanted to provide for them, and He wanted them to trust Him in that. So verses 11 and 12 of chapter 16 says this, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat. In other words, when the sun goes down, you shall eat meat. And in the morning you shall be filled with bread. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Okay, so what he's saying here, the things that you complained about that you didn't have meat and you didn't have bread. I'm going to provide that for you. At sundown, I'm going to provide this for you. And at next morning when you get up, you're going to have this. And the reason why is so that you'll know that I am God, that I am the one that provided this for you. You didn't provide it for yourselves. So did Israel deserve this kind of kindness from the Lord? Of course not. They were just complaining. Could Moses or Aaron provide for them? No, Israel couldn't provide for themselves. They deserved to be punished for their complaining, but God was gracious. And that's the thing we need to remember. So what does He do? Let's see what God does. In verses 13 through 15, it says this, So it was that quail came up at evening and covered the camp. And in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. Now, what they termed those little kind of wafers or what are this round substance is manna. And so when you hear about manna from heaven, this is exactly what they're talking about, this particular incident. So at nighttime they had meat. In the morning they had this bread. They said it was sweet. So God kept His promise, didn't He? He is the provider. God is the one who provides. And that old saying, you hear this, God helps those who help themselves. That is an oxymoron. It just doesn't even make any sense. God doesn't help those who help themselves. God will help those who He decides to help. So God did not help the Israelites who could not help themselves. He helped them because they could not help themselves. That's the point. God will help a person when they can't help themselves. There's nothing they can do for it. And that's the time when the Lord is seen, because then you recognize it's the Lord who did it. Now remember, He's feeding about 2.5 million people at this time. So these quail that came in, man, it says there that they ate so much that it felt like it was just coming out of their nostrils. There was that much quail. It was just, and the stuff began to stink. It was so bad. Now Exodus 16:35, it gives us a little bit of a glimpse about how long this took place. It says this, And the children of Israel ate manna 40 years, until they came to an inhabited land. And they ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So all the time of their wilderness wanderings for 40 years, God provided for them in this way. So, in time, did Israel believe God? Did they finally trust Him? Did they say, what you're saying is true? Well, let's just read. In Exodus 17, verses 1 through 4, it says this, Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, Why is it that you have brought us up out of Egypt and to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. So here we see them complaining once again, first about food, now about water. And Israel complained again, and rather than going to God, they went to Moses and told him, Why haven't you given us these things? Moses couldn't do anything. All he could do was make a request to the Lord. But the Lord is the one who provided. People are never satisfied with what God provides. That's the problem with mankind. You see, you saw that with Eve. She wasn't satisfied with the things that Satan was providing or offering her. She already had. She wasn't satisfied, didn't think that was enough, so I wanted to go a little bit extra. Cain wasn't satisfied with using one of the firstborn of the flock as an offering. He wanted to use what he wanted to do. The Tower of Babel, the people weren't satisfied with God's command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, so they decided to build a city and make a name for themselves by building that tower. So people tend not to be satisfied with what God wants because they think they need more. But God says, I've given you everything you need in order to be content and happy. So anyway, that's where we're at. So God tells Moses what he needs to do after this request. And God still cared for the Israelites, even though they didn't trust him. So it says this in Exodus 17, verses 5 and the first part of 6. And the Lord said to Moses, Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, talking about the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink. So God's going to provide water for them, but he's not telling them to go to a particular river. He's going to make water come out of this rock. So God tells Moses to strike a rock, not dig wells. That's not what he told him to do. So Moses follows God's instructions. And guess what? The people got their water. So remember what I told you before? That sin never affects just the person who does the sinning. Well, neither does righteousness. So when Moses acted in a righteous way, it affected all the people of Israel. They all drank from that because he believed God. All right? So in verse B, it says this about Moses. In chapter 17, verse 6, and the last part. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So Moses obeyed God. He listened to what God said and did what he did. So God provided for Moses, for the Israelites, and for all of the livestock. We're talking about 2.5 million people plus all their livestock. You can imagine how much that they drank. So in Psalm 105, verse 41, it says, He opened the rock, and the waters gushed out. They ran in the dry places like a river. So now as they're leaving, once again, as we go back, we see where Moses and the Israelites are leaving Egypt. They're now on the other side of the Red Sea. They've been delivered once and for all from Egypt, never to return to there again. And they go out into the wilderness, and now they're going to have a time of testing. Now, they don't know they're going to be in the desert for 40 years. As a matter of fact, that wasn't even the original intention. But we'll see why that changed later on, why they ended up being there for 40 years. But in any event, in their going out, they said one of the complaints that they had is that we're hungry, we don't have any meat, we don't have any of that stuff. And he says, you should have just let us die in Egypt, where it was good for us, but we could have died happy. And so God provides meat for them. And then they complain about the water, and God provides the water. So God is providing for them, and all they need to do is learn to trust him, that he knows what he's doing, and they will enjoy their time. So God is keeping his promise to Abraham and to continue the line of the deliverer. He told, he protected Israel. God protected Israel. God delivered Israel he protected Israel while they were in Egypt. He delivered Israel out of Egypt, and he sustains Israel after Egypt. So he's continuing to do all these things for them. God does it in spite of Israel because of his promise to Abraham. See, Israel could do things that were not consistent with what God wanted, but God had made a promise, a covenant with Abraham. And because of that covenant, he couldn't go back on it. He wouldn't go back on it. I shouldn't say couldn't. He wouldn't. Even if he could, he wouldn't, because God's nature and character is involved. God does not lie. And so he made a promise to Abraham that in you all nations of the earth shall be blessed, and they are going to be. And one day the deliverer would come through the line of Abraham. So that's a pretty interesting thing. I think it's great, and I really appreciate that story. Now we're going to get along more because there's more of this whole issue of the wilderness. And once we get to that and get finished with that, then we'll move on a little bit faster. But just want you to understand these things. Listen, if you have some friends that want to listen to this, please have them subscribe to my podcast, either my audio or video. If they want to subscribe to my audio podcast, just tell them to get on their favorite podcast app and look up the Premature Bible Institute, and they should be able to find that. And if they want to watch a video podcast, just get on YouTube and look for my name, Doug Schaible, Schaible, and they can get on there and subscribe to my podcast. And also, so there's some other things that they can look at on that site too about tribal testimonies and thoughts on cross-cultural church planting. So just want to say thanks so much for listening, and I just pray that this will be a blessing to you, and will, as you keep going on, you realize more and more that God is God and we are not. Take care. Bye.